Thank you everyone for tuning into this webinar today. Our webinar is entitled Biden and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a look at US policy 1 year into the presidency. We're joined by folks in dozens of countries, so I just want to say hi to everyone in the US and Palestine and Israel and other places in the world. This is the latest installment of Partners for Progressive Israel's webinar series called Conversations with Israel and Palestine, and it provides an important link between progressives in the Middle East and those in the US and around the world. My name is Ron Skolnick. I organize these webinars on behalf of the organization. Before I hand it over to Ambassador Alon Pinkas, who will be moderating today, I'm going to note that Partners for Progressive Israel is an American for nonprofit dedicated to the achievement of a durable and just peace between Israel and its neighbors, and that includes an end to Israel's occupation based on a two-state solution. Partners supports Israelis working to ensure social justice, civil rights, and equality for all of Israel's inhabitants, and it cultivates Jewish-Arab partnerships to that end. Partners seeks to deepen Americans' understanding of Israel's and Palestine's complexities so they can better advocate for a progressive future for all the inhabitants of the region. Now, Partners is, as you, I'm sure you know, bringing this webinar to you today for free and is glad to do so. But if you enjoy it and want more programming like it, please visit progressiveisrael.org and make a contribution if you can. And last but not least, before I introduce our panel today, I'll note that our next webinar in the series is going to be on February 16 at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be having a panel that discusses the Israeli left's participation in the center-right government of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and our alternate Prime Minister, Yair Lapid. So let me move on. Let me introduce our panelists and moderators. You can find their fuller bios either on our eBlast or on the Facebook event page. Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen directs the Israeli-Palestinian conflict program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And she frequently presents and publishes in academic, policy, and media forums on civil society efforts and policy efforts related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She's previously worked with the U.S. Department of State as an Arabic language specialist and was program officer for the Kennedy School of Government's Middle East Initiative at Harvard University, where she managed the Israeli, Palestinian, and Saudi Arabian portfolios. She's proficient in Hebrew and Arabic and received her master's degree from Georgetown's Arabic department. Dov Waxman, our second panelist, directs the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA, where he's also a professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies. He received his PhD and MA from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. His research interests include, among other things, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israeli politics, US-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, and other matters. He publishes widely in scholarly journals, as well as columns in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, Haaretz, and he's a frequent TV and radio commentator. His most recent books, he's written 4, are Trouble in the Tribe, the American Jewish Conflict over Israel, and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know, which was published in 2019. Last but not least, our moderator today is Ambassador Alon Pinkas. He served as Israel's Consul General in New York from 2000 to 2004. He has served as Chief of Staff to 2 Israeli foreign ministers and was the advisor on US affairs to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He was the policy advisor to Shimon and Ehud Barak when they served as foreign ministers. Ambassador Pinkas participated in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that followed the 2000 Camp David summit. He was a member of the UN-Israel negotiating team on Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, and also negotiations with Syria during the 1991 to 2001 period, and was appointed by Prime Minister Barak to the US-Israel Strategic Policy Planning Group. Ambassador Pinkas now works as a foreign affairs analyst and commentator in both Israeli and non-Israeli media outlets. That includes TV and radio and newspapers. I personally read him regularly in Haaretz. He holds an MA cum laude in US government and international relations from Georgetown University in DC. Let me now hand it over to Alon Pinkas. I'll join you at the end to say goodbye and thank you. So thank you very much, Lucy and Dov and Alon, and have a great webinar. Take care till the end.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron, very much. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for your kind words. I'd just like to point out that all these negotiations I participated with were the unsuccessful negotiations. I have yet to participate in a successful negotiation, and I think that's somewhat relevant to our discussion. I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us from what I understand are 13 different countries and territories and various US states. And let me describe to you in 2-3 paragraphs what this is how this is going to be structured. We will have a conversation, the three of us, mostly Lucy and Dov will converse for the first 35-40 minutes, and then we will open this up to questions and answers for the last 20 minutes. If you notice, you have on the bottom of your screens, whatever device you're using, you have a Q&A icon. So please, I ask you and urge you to use that in order to type in your questions rather than the chat option that's available on Zoom, because we can't monitor the chat. And so there's a very good chance, 99%, that a question posted on the chat option will be ignored. And that's a pity, because it could have been a good question. So let's start with this. I'll present to you a premise. I'll submit to you a premise to which I'd like the two of you to open this up. And it follows like this. The US has lost interest in the Middle East. The US has been gradually but persistently disengaging from the Middle East. It has to do with several factors: energy independence, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the fatigue and hemorrhaging of too many foreign entanglements and wars in the Middle East, and a shift in focus and priorities to the Far East, to the Pacific Rim, particularly to China, the South China Sea, and so on. And so the combination of all these has led the US to reprioritize its foreign policy in the region. It still has some outstanding issues, but when it comes to Israel and the Palestinian issue, the US, and I know this is a cliche and I'm repeating what various presidents and secretaries of state have said since the 90s, the US cannot want peace more than the parties. And Israel and the Palestinians, each for their own reasons, justifiable or not, do not seem to either have the will or the political leadership or the ability to engage in a serious, far-reaching peace process that would lead, or political process that would possibly lead to some kind of settlement. And so on the basis of this opening premise, to which you can agree or disagree partially or wholly, I'm asking either one of you, why should anyone have any kind of expectations from the US to get itself, from the Biden administration in particular, in just completing his first year, why should anyone have any expectations or hopes that the US will get involved and fail again almost inevitably in an Israeli-Palestinian issue that seems not to interest anyone anymore? I open this up to you. You're both on mute, by the way.
Well, I'm happy. Lucy, would you like to take this one first? We'll follow on.
Sure, I'll start off. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ron, for the kind introduction, and really a pleasure to be here, particularly in this conversation with Dov. So I think with that rather bleak opening context, I think you've laid out what undergirds what we're seeing of the approach of the Biden administration. I would agree that there is a reprioritization when it comes to foreign policy of the administration. And I think those of us looking at the administration before it entered office, and then the first few months of office, looking to divine or discern where the administration was going to go on this conflict, I think noted two things that were going to be very clear, either principles or pillars, if you will, with which they were going to approach this conflict. I think one, they did articulate that there would be a reversal of policies that they felt that the Trump administration had taken, that they articulated as undercutting peace or where they thought the US position should be on this conflict. But two, I think they were very clear about the fact that they were not going to let themselves be sidetracked or sidelined by this conflict, diverted from focus on other priorities, whether domestic or foreign policy. And I think that you've seen that. I think the one thing I would say when you look at those two principles, I think they have not ignored this conflict. And I think where they have been able to reconcile those two principles and do those two things simultaneously, address things that they felt were counterproductive during the Trump administration, and keep it from derailing other priorities. I think where they've been able to do that simultaneously, they've done it. So you've seen that, and we can maybe talk in more detail about this afterwards. But we saw, for example, restoration of some of the aid that was cut to the Palestinians. But where those two principles have come into conflict with each other, they have chosen a path of least resistance, where trying to reverse some of those policies or take some bolder steps perhaps towards the conflict will have meant more resistance from the Israeli government, more of a battle maybe domestically. They have chosen that path of least resistance. And I think that comes down to a calculation that you indicated in your opening remarks, which is, I think that they are, and similar to many before them and many in the international community, look at the Israeli and Palestinian leadership, do not see much chance of success for various reasons that, again, maybe we can get into further in the conversation. And so don't calculate that it is worth expending a lot of resources and capital for something that they don't think the parties are ready to move forward with. And so the last point I'd make on this, I think in some ways the proof of concept and the interesting moment for this was May of last year, May of 21, when we saw things explode in Jerusalem and sort of approximately in Gaza related to that. And I think that was a moment where I think some of us looked and said, will this be the moment where the administration says, okay, we can try to ignore this conflict, but it won't let us. It's always going to force its way back onto the agenda, and therefore we have to do something. And I think what we saw there, and I think are seeing since, is perhaps an indication that, and as I said at the time, this is an administration that is not staffed with novices on this conflict. They know this conflict. They know to expect flashpoints, particularly Jerusalem and Gaza, to flare up perennially. And I think this is a calculated risk and strategy to say, look, the cost of doing business with this conflict is that we are going to have to fight perennially. We will do what we can with sort of the low-hanging fruit in the meantime to keep this as stable as possible. But we're not willing to invest that much up front for some of the reasons we've discussed in trying to what I would call fireproof or maybe even prevent these things from flaring up more frequently if it means expending a lot of political capital and resources that detract from other issues.
Dov?
Yes, so I would agree, I think, really with your characterization that the United States is shifting away from the region. Although I think it's more about a kind of rebalancing than a retreat altogether. I think having kind of been so focused on the region for the last few decades, there's a kind of understandable need now to shift its attention to Asia Pacific and be a bit less consumed with the Middle East. So I agree with your underlying premise that US strategic interests in the region are changing. There is a shift away from the region, and that this does impact the Biden administration's approach to the conflict. I think even the most passionate advocates of Israeli-Palestinian peace, and I would consider myself among them, had very little expectation that this would be a priority for the Biden administration. I think if anybody thought, that the Biden administration was going to come into office and prioritize the conflict in the way that President Trump did or President Obama did, was really, not taking into account the circumstances that the Biden administration found itself in. Of course, domestically with COVID and internationally with a whole host of other issues on its agenda. So no doubt about it, I think the lower priority that the Biden administration has placed on the conflict makes sense in terms of the pressing challenges that the administration faces and more broadly, the declining strategic interest in the region. However, I would say a couple of things. I think, first of all, the United States has never had as great a strategic interest in resolving the conflict as have obviously Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, the US has always had a lesser interest. But I think in many ways, for many years, there was a belief that resolving this conflict would help the United States manage both its relationships with its Arab allies and with Israel. And so there was a good strategic argument for engaging for conflict resolution. Now, as we've seen that the United States can have good relationships with its key Arab states and with Israel, and obviously the Abraham Accords underlies this, there is less of a strategic interest for the United States. It's less pressing. But I think for the Biden administration in particular, there is a political interest in at least making sure that this conflict is kept on a low boil and doesn't spill over into escalating violence. We saw what happened in May, as Lucy mentioned. What that shows for the Biden administration is not only that, you know, an escalation of violence can end up consuming its attention and distracting it from other foreign policy priorities, but also that it's a political problem for a Democratic president, given the trends within the Democratic Party, given the growing divide between progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party over US policy toward Israel. So for President Biden himself, ensuring that this doesn't become a major issue and it doesn't occupy Congress is a political benefit for him to prevent this kind of internecine warfare within the Democratic Party. And I would just say also, I think, and obviously this isn't going to be the major factor for the United States, but it's a moral issue. Insofar as the United States is Israel's biggest donor, $3.8 billion a year, it's protected Israel in various ways in the United Nations. So in the eyes of many people, the US support for Israel and the continuation of the conflict affects the United States' soft power in the eyes of the world and other countries because of this relationship with Israel. And so even though you might say the conflict is not nearly that important and the United States shouldn't be judged by its stance on the conflict, nevertheless, I think there is still a case to be made, both in political, moral, and even strategic terms for engagement. But I think where I agree with you, and I think Lucy as well, is what we're seeing is that conflict management, ensuring that the conflict doesn't escalate or become destabilizing, that there is an interest there. But conflict resolution, given the very low prospects for conflict resolution in the first place, I think no doubt there's little strategic interest for conflict resolution. And that unfortunately is a tragedy for both Israel and the Palestinians.
So let me delve somewhat deeper and follow up on what both of you have said. And I'll start with a counterpoint. Okay, it's been established that the US is disengaging from the Middle East. It's not just the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There's a pattern here. If you do a children's coloring book, you'll see the figure once you're done with the coloring by numbers. The US did not intervene in Libya. The US did not intervene in Egypt. The US refrained from any kind of involvement in Yemen. The US stayed out of Syria, you know, to varying degrees. The US is dealt with Iran, but then was presented with a unilateral withdrawal. So now they're trying to fix that. If it'll happen or not remains to be seen. But in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and here I'm going deeper, the US will not initiate anything, certainly not since John Kerry's failed a major attempt in 2014. Essentially, the US policy is based on the Clinton parameters of December 2000 or January 2001, depends which version you're looking at, they're almost identical. But here's my question. The US will not be standoffish. The US will not refuse or be reluctant to get involved if the sides come up to the US and ask it to mediate. Okay, that we know. Now, given that, if you agree, here's my question to you, or my next premise for submission. The two-state model is no longer viable. The two-state model is not feasible. The two-state model is not acceptable as any kind of a durable, stable agreement whose contours can be agreed on. It doesn't matter whose fault it is, Israeli settlement policy, Palestinian terrorism, particular issues, specific issues like Jerusalem or the Palestinian refugees or what have you. The division between the West Bank and Gaza makes it even not only geographically discontiguous, but also politically discontiguous at this point. And so in order for the US to be re-involved or re-engaged in the region, Israel and the Palestinians need to either agree that the two-state model can't be done, or somehow agree that it can be done and explain how, and only then ask for the US's involvement. So my question to you is, or my food for thought for you is the two-state model still valid? Not if it's right, not if it's the right thing to do, but is it still an implementable and feasible political settlement? Either one.
Sure. Shall I go take this one first? Yeah, well, this is, the much debated question. I would say, I think, and I hope this won't come across as hedging, I think it depends on which two-state model we're talking about. So the traditional two-state model, which involved kind of this idea of complete separate, or this aspiration, at least on the Israeli side, for complete separation, for the idea that there would be two separate states, with the vast majority of the with settlements, beyond those closest to the Green Line, evacuated and dismantled. That with the two-state model as pursued through the years of the Oslo peace process, I think that model is done. Is effective. Okay, but largely because for political reasons, though, not because there's too many settlements or settlers, but because there's the political.
There's a question, though. There's a pertinent question from Ms. Jessica Brown, who is asking, is there any prospect for the administration to leverage the Abraham Accords to further efforts for two-state solution? Or, this is my addition, or the two separate issues that do not necessarily have anything in common policy-wise?
Yeah, I think actually, so I think one of the things the United States could do, and in fact should do, is to actually encourage recognition of Palestinian statehood, as many European countries have already done. That would reinvigorate a two-state model by recognizing the state of Palestine as it currently exists, albeit under Israeli occupation. That, I think, could be done through, particularly, the big prize for the normalization is, of course, Saudi Arabia. And I think getting the Saudis to have a normalization agreement with Israel could be leveraged in order to get the Israelis to accept a major move on the part of the United States to, as I said, recognize Palestinian statehood. So I think with enough creative diplomacy, there is a way to use Saudi Arabia's, the prospect of normalization between Israel and Saudi, which is a real strategic goal for Israel, and use that and get the Saudis as well to then leverage that to really shake up the status quo. But I don't think, unfortunately, the Biden
actually, though, before I let Lucy answer or respond to this, it goes both ways. This creativity or this potential creative ideas reservoir, it could go both ways, because Israel can be used by the Saudis to change their not so great status and image in the U.S. in the last 2 to 3 years. And so this could be a way for them, but I don't speak for the Saudis, and I can't claim to understand. Lucy, would you, do you agree with what Dov said about the two-state and the leveraging?
I think I'd like to connect a few things that we just sort of discussed in the last couple of minutes. So one, when you posed your question about two states, I think one of the key things you mentioned in the framing of that question was, won't it take the parties to come together and acknowledge, both the parties acknowledge that the two-state is no longer feasible, viable, however you want to frame it, we need to move on. And I think this is the crux of the issue. When we've talked about what will be a sustainable solution, we have to talk about what will be a mutually agreeable negotiated solution. And I think until both parties are on the same page that we have to pursue something that is not two states, then we're going to be stuck in this limbo period, because while the Israelis—
You have an idea what could substitute a two-state model, given that for Israelis, one state is a non-starter?
Well, and I think that's the point. I think this is why we all keep circling back to the two-state solution. I don't think it's through lack of imagination. I think there have been studies done by many organizations, many individuals, of what are alternatives to the two-state solution. You're seeing a lot of energy being picked up behind, for example, Confederate models recently, which I tend to see as a variation on a two-state. I'm not sure how you get to a confederation without first having two states to confederate with each other. But there is a lot of work that's been done and is being done on this. But as I think you're pointing out, Ambassador, Israel is not willing to accept sort of a one state, given what that will mean, you know, for the Zionist project and the vision of Israel that embodied in that. And yet you have a prime minister of Israel currently who says no Palestinian state, basically on my watch. The Palestinian leadership is still holding to the West Bank Palestinian leadership. The PA and Fatah is holding to two states as the goal. But of course you have a divided leadership. And when you ask the publics, the Israeli and Palestinian publics, where they come out and what they want to see, there's less and less support on both sides for two states. And yet you have a plurality of support on both sides still for two states being the best alternative there is out there. Yeah, so we keep circling back to this. And to tie this though to the Abraham Accords, I think I completely agree with Dov. In an ideal world, there is leverage to be used. These Abraham Accords would be used creatively, with creative diplomacy as leverage to make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We haven't really seen any indication of inclination on the part of the parties so far to do that. Certainly not by the UAE, who was the pioneer of these agreements. And I think that gets back to the assessment I mentioned at the beginning. I think these parties have all assessed that the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership are not in a place to make progress on this issue. And so they don't want to have other interests held hostage to waiting on that. And yes, go ahead.
But I mean, I'm out of government now, so I can't claim to know what's the thinking inside the government. But I'd say that in the last 10 years, okay, since at least Mr. Netanyahu was prime minister since 2009, so that makes it 12 years, 13 years. There's a nightmare scenario being drawn in Israeli planning, whether it's military intelligence or political. And that nightmare scenario is that the Palestinian Authority disbands itself voluntarily, saying, look, basically you want us, you have us. You have made a two-state solution impossible, impractical, unviable, whatever other synonyms exist. And our economy is inextricably tied to the Israeli economy. So there's no economic sustainability to a Palestinian entity. And since since you show no signs of granting us any kind of sovereignty beyond the Bantustans that exist right now, we are dismantling the Palestinian Authority. We just ask for one thing: one man, one vote. South Africa, US pre-civil rights, one man, one vote. What do we do then? If we don't come prepared with an alternative to the two-state that's not viable, and Mr. Jason Berkowitz just asked on the Q&A, how would a confederation even work? To which I'd say, I don't know, because there are very few confederations that actually work in the world or worked in history, but that's beside the point. There are two confederations that people are talking about. One is an Israeli-Palestinian confederation, so a dual confederation, and there's a tripartite confederation with Jordan. That I'm not saying that Jordanians are on board. I'm not saying that they express their consent. But my point is not to take time from you two. If the two-state model is not working, if the Israeli government is reluctant to acknowledge that there is a silver lining, that it may not be implementable now, but it could be in 5 years, giving the Palestinians some kind of hope. The Palestinians are not coming with any idea. And if the Americans are not getting re-engaged, what then?
Well, first of all, I want to push back on the idea that this two-state solution is totally dead. Because as I said, I think we should distinguish between the two-state solution as a complete solution to the conflict that resolves all of the permanent status issues and the ability to achieve a two-state reality. What we have at the moment is a one-state reality. We have one state controlling the entire area effectively between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. I think it is possible to move toward a two-state reality without talking about two-state solution. In other words, to actually empower the Palestinian Authority as a state, while not necessarily addressing all of the issues that need to be resolved. So I don't accept the idea that it's impossible to achieve two states. I think it's impossible to resolve the conflict in its entirety, but I think it is possible to achieve two states. And as a supporter of confederation, I actually think that recognition of a Palestinian state and establishment of a two-state reality could in turn pave the way for a confederal solution down the line. I think ultimately we're talking about a long-term process, but I don't think we should just kind of assume that this one-state reality is set in stone, and the only question now is, when or how will Israel enfranchise Palestinians? But I do think that certainly that is, unless there is a real attempt to change this one-state reality, either to democratize it by giving Palestinians in the occupied territories the right to vote, or by allowing for Palestinian effectively succession to establish a Palestinian state and recognize it, then I think, inevitably the pressure will continue to grow on Israel to enfranchise, to give Palestinians the vote. And what we're already seeing the reality that increasingly this is an issue that is viewed as a human rights issue. This is not an issue now, as a conflict so much as it is an issue perceived in the United States and around the world as a human rights issue. And therefore, as long as human rights is a concern for the US foreign policy to the extent that it is, then I think the United States will have an interest in trying to improve the human rights situation on the ground.
Let me just add to that one sentence before turning it over to Lucy. It's not just a human rights issue. It's that if there's no resolution, and I take some of what I'm saying now from a question that we were asked by Mr. David Abraham, if there's no resolution and the U.S. doesn't get involved, then Israel will increasingly be defined as an apartheid state. Now, I don't believe Israel is an apartheid state. I honestly don't think it's the correct use of the term. It is a vile accusation, but as long as the occupation, quote unquote, persists, and as long as there's no solution, the U.S. will find it very hard to defend Israel in the world against the accusation or the criticism that this is showing signs or has the manifestations of what is considered apartheid in the definition of apartheid, not necessarily the South African. I think it's very wrong. I think it's misguided, but nonetheless it exists. Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what the last couple of minutes of conversation has pointed to is a couple of issues that are central to what we're seeing happening. I think that the right wing in Israel, the right wing leadership who are saying sort of no Palestinian state right now or no two states on my watch have yet to come up with an answer of what's the political horizon, what's the future long-term vision, what's the alternative, what happens when you play this out. And you played out a couple of these scenarios already. Alon, when Palestinians, and they've been there for a while, certainly in the younger generation of Palestinians, I've been hearing for a while, and polling bears it out, and by a while, I mean a few years now, that forget a state. I don't need a state. You can call where I live Israel, you can call it Palestine, you can call it whatever. I just want my rights. I want the right, my rights, I want freedom of movement, I want the vote. And so that rights-based discourse, as opposed to a states-based discourse, has been alive and I think growing, certainly in the younger generation on the Palestinian side. And I don't think I have yet heard an answer to that dilemma from the Israeli right in terms of what they define as their interests long term. Likewise, this idea that we've talked about of managing the conflict, and that's very much what you're seeing right now, right? This shrinking the conflict terminology and framing we've been hearing that Naftali Bennett has embraced, and it can only go so far without a defined political horizon. So to get to Dov's point that yes, can we move in some ways that aligns, I think, with this idea of moving from what's a current one-state reality to a two-state reality, even if it's not yet a solution that solves all problems. I don't know how you bring the Palestinians on board and along unless whatever is being done to convert from a one-state reality to a two-state reality is done with a North Star defined. As this is where we're heading. We might not be able to get there today for various political reasons, but if we don't know where we're going and we don't know to what end these steps are being taken, economic improvements are great. I'm sure many, and they have been, many Palestinians been welcoming them, but if it's not heading to a clear defined future where those rights are being realized, it's only going to be able to go so far. I would only say to bring us back, and as you can see, I'm not ready yet to give up on this two-state solution viability, and not just, it's not just about the fact that the parties actually aren't ready or don't have a good alternative. We were talking about the Abraham Accords before. There's a lot that's been made of the fact that the Abraham Accords shattered this paradigm of the Arab Peace Initiative, and that what the Arab states essentially who've come on board with this are saying, or seem to be saying, is forget the Palestinian cause. And what I would say is I think that's a bit of an overreach with interpretation. I think we definitely see, as I already said, the Arab states not willing to invest, some of them not willing to invest a lot in trying to improve the plight of the, or sort of fight for the cause of the Palestinians here in relation to these Abraham Accords. They did upend the structure of the API. What the states who signed peace agreements essentially said was, we're willing to normalize with Israel without first having to achieve, see Palestinian statehood achieved along the following parameters. But what they did not do is throw those parameters overboard. You haven't heard any of those states say, in fact, we're done with the two-state solution and don't really care if there's a Palestinian state at all. They're still, if only rhetorically, but they are still, all of them, rhetorically saying that our goal for this is a two-state solution. And the Emirates will be the first to point out that, remember, we insisted on no annexation in order to, we were the ones that brought about Netanyahu not annexing by, dangling this deal of the Abraham Accords and being able to prevent it. So we have to remember that this is still, as much as the international community, including key regional actors, are not that invested in doing a lot to resolve this conflict right now, there is still a consensus of how they think it needs to resolve at such time as it becomes resolvable.
I have to say, Lucy, I mean, I agree 100% and subscribe to everything you said, but I look at it from a slightly different angle. The fact that the world is losing interest or not as engaged or not as committed, I don't regard as an achievement, an accomplishment, or a victory for Israel. It only tells me that as the problem grows and becomes more difficult to settle and solve, Israel is left to its own devices. Israel and the Palestinians, which leads me to a question. Dov, if you were a Palestinian and you're looking at the Israeli political system right now, with a prime minister and a foreign minister, by the way, who both said no Palestinian state, in fact, no negotiations under our watch, sequential watch, Bennett and then Mr. Lapid, due to replace it in August 2023. If you were a Palestinian, what would you do to sway Israeli public opinion if there's anything that can be done? This is a question from Martin.
I think it may be, it's important to distinguish between whether I was a Palestinian in the upper ranks of the Palestinian Authority versus a Palestinian civilian living in the West Bank or Gaza. And I think, you know, I don't want to dodge this question, but I think it's what is already evident is that the Palestinian Authority or senior officials in the Palestinian Authority have their own interest in perpetuating the Palestinian Authority. So much as you may be right that it may be, you know, there is, you wonder when will the PA decide to hand back the keys to Israel and say it's your problem. I think it's very clear already that the Palestinian Authority is a kind of self-perpetuating elite, which therefore does not have an interest, which is different than the interest of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority has an interest to preserve itself and the prerogatives and perks that they get. So I think that will continue. But for the Palestinian people, no, I think, you know, there is very little. I think there are things. I think, you know, the kind of civil society programs and the peace building projects that are taking place are ways in which Israelis and Palestinians can really try to shift each other's perception of each other and change, you know, reduce some of the mistrust that's accumulated and convince each other that they are partners for peace. The problem, of course, now is that on the Palestinian side, for a host of understandable reasons, there isn't even a willingness to engage, not just with the Israeli government, but with Israeli society. There's this anti-normalization kind of dogma, which makes it very difficult for Palestinian civil society actors and Palestinians who want to engage and want to reach out to Israelis. So I think, you know, there needs to be, I think that's a problem, and I think there absolutely needs to be much more engagement across these two societies. In terms of the Israeli political system, what could be done? Again, you know, I think that the President Abbas has repeatedly expressed a willingness to negotiate you know, disavowal of violence. I don't think there's a whole lot that Abbas or the PLO can do to convince Naftali Bennett or others on the Israeli right. And I think, so I think you know, the issue is really not so much the Israeli government, but Israeli public opinion. And it's very hard to shift Israeli public opinion on this matter because they have been convinced, going back to Prime Minister Ehud Barak, that the Palestinians aren't a partner. And they've been, you know, subjected to, you know, many, many years of being told that the Palestinians are not suitable for, are not interested in peace. And I think it's going to be very hard to change that. So as I say, I think on the one hand, the changing public opinion is a multi-year, long-term project which needs to be done and is already starting through peace building. But on the top, but what we need to have in addition to that is the diplomatic developments to give hope. I think actually, as Lucy said, both sides, the primary reason why support for a two-state solution has declined is largely because both sides believe the other isn't interested in it. So right. I think if you are able to engage in that kind of peace building, that's one step. And the other, as I said, is to try to create some major shifts on from above that political horizon. And again, I think that can be done. I think actually even the Bennett government can have an interest in ensuring that the Palestinian Authority doesn't collapse and empowering the Palestinian Authority in at least in certain areas of the West Bank.
Okay, I could not agree more with the distinction you made between the Palestinian Authority as a political elite with a self-invested or self-vested interest in perpetuating its own existence, okay, and the Palestinian people in the West Bank, not to mention the geographical and political separation between the West Bank and Gaza. That said, this dynamic could cause an internal combustion inside the Palestinian Authority. I could see a grassroots, I don't want to call it revolution because it's too pretentious a term, but I could see the Palestinian Authority being, it's already being attacked and severely criticized. The question is, I asked you about the Palestinians, so I'll ask Lucy, what would you do if you were Israel, given the current political climate and composition of the Israeli government? And if it does change, by the way, because Mr. Netanyahu is going to leave politics and there's going to be some kind of implosion or disintegration inside Likud and the government will change, it'll not shift to the left. If anything, it'll be more consolidated on the right. So what would you do if you were Israel, Lucy?
Well, look, I'm going to dodge the question a little bit because I don't want to. I guess I won't pretend to speak or try to speak, I suppose, on behalf of Israelis or Palestinians. What I would
Look,
reflect.
Lucy, we have 9.5 million prime ministers here. One more isn't going to hurt anyone. So please feel free.
Well, what I would just reflect, I mean, look, you've seen in order to get to this quite remarkable, in the true sense of the word, coalition that you have in Israel right now, right? You have this incredibly ideologically, politically disparate coalition. And as has been observed ad nauseum, the reason we got there, so the one thing, the glue that brought them together and held them together was the shared interest in keeping Netanyahu out of power. But a sort of a deal that was struck even tacitly, or maybe not actually so tacitly, by those members of the coalition, I think, was that in order to keep together, we're going to have to avoid dealing with the thing that's going to tear us apart the most, on which we're going to focus on the issues on which we can agree and try to avoid as much as possible the issues that will tear us apart. And of course, number one issue there is the conflict with the Palestinians and what to do about it. And I think the challenge is, Dov was referencing civil society and peace building efforts, and you referenced what could happen next in the future Israeli government. When you look at the trends in Israeli society that you're asking me about, I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right. I think certainly at the adult level, it's in the realm of 57 to 60% of certainly of Jewish Israeli adults self-identify as right-wing, and as we know, that tends to be
but you know that, Lucy, that's a cultural thing. The cross section is more cultural, anti-elitist. It's not right-wing. It's like the Trumpists in America. They're Trumpists because the divide is cultural and more than socioeconomic. It's not just about the Palestinian issue. They don't define themselves as right-wing because of the Palestinian issue. By the way, voters who voted, Lucy, in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, to those joining us now who forgot we had 4 election cycles in the last 2.5 years, these voters were just born during Camp David when Mr. Barak, as Dov mentioned correctly, emerged and said, there's no partner at this time. So,
well, I was about to say I don't presume to argue with an Israeli about Israeli society, though I'm about to raise a question about what you're saying, because while I get your point, I do think that what we have seen is that when you talk about, with self-identification, talking about right and left in Israel, not exclusively and not because it doesn't map precisely, as we know, onto what you'd consider to be right and left in the American context. But what we do know is that right and left, in terms of a self-identification in Israel, does tend to speak a lot to where people position themselves on the issue of security, and which often translates into positioning on peace and peace process issues and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I will further note that we actually, where I work at USAP, we, along with an organization called Olmec, had partnered on a polling study of youth, Israeli-Palestinian youth attitudes, ages 15 to 21 on both sides. And let's take it away from, abstract it from the terms right and left. What we can certainly say from that, and I know polling is just one snapshot, is that the attitudes in the younger generations on both sides, and again, we're looking at 15 to 21-year-olds, are incredibly and increasingly hardline in terms of attitudes towards the other side, towards the vision of whether the other side is a partner for peace, towards whether they will engage with it, they're interested in engaging with each other, whether the other side has a legitimate attachment to the land. All these things that will be needed to move towards a shared future together of some kind, whether in a one-state outcome, a two-state solution, however you want to look at it, all these markers bode ill. And this is where I think, Dove references work that can be to the society level. But this is the challenge, and this is why I go back to political horizon. And if I can just say then the last thing, going back to something Dove said, the Palestinian and Israeli leadership are the ones, they are going to have to engage, choose to engage diplomatically on this at some point or not. The Palestinians have more of an urgency, a sense of urgency to do it. The Israelis are clearly not feeling the sense of urgency to have to take the risks, and there are risks involved with trying to move forward and move away from a one-state reality in this situation. Yes. And I think that Abbas, as you have referenced, is incredibly weak. The Palestinian polity is divided, and we see the numbers from Palestinians and their support or significant lack thereof for Abbas. He is not unfortunately positioned. I think this is partly the assessment of the Israeli leadership, the American leadership, to go back to where we started, and the international community, that he may be, as I think Dove was indicating, he might be the best possibility of a Palestinian leader that the Israelis have to be able to negotiate some kind of two-state solution with at this point. But is he in a position to do so either with his own public, and certainly, with this divided political situation you have, and I think that's why we saw, no response when the Kerry initiative that you referenced earlier, Alon, there was no official response to that on the Palestinian side, and so it tells you some of the challenges that the parties are facing and that the international community is facing when it decides how heavily to invest in this.
All right, we have a few minutes to take, well, there are about 21 questions, 6 or 7 of which I answered. I typed answers to save us some time. There is a recurring question about should the US do more about the daily life of Israeli occupation, meaning evictions, rezoning of neighborhoods in Jerusalem, treatment of Palestinians in roadblocks. Now, I don't think we should get into the tactical nuts and bolts of how this works, but the question is valid. Should the US be doing more on this in terms of making its voice more noticeable?
So, well, first of all, I don't think we should assume that the US isn't doing anything at the moment, because it's not doing it publicly or vocally. The Biden administration's whole approach to this issue has been to work quietly behind the scenes. And so I think it's quite possible the administration is behind the scenes voicing its displeasure, putting some maybe quiet pressure on the Israeli government, even if it's not doing so publicly. And we're certainly seeing it take that approach with regards to Israeli settlement building. But there's no question in my mind that the United States should be paying attention and applying pressure when necessary on the Israeli government to respect the human rights of Palestinians, both those particularly those in the occupied territories, especially in just this past week, a Palestinian American, an elderly Palestinian American was taken by Israeli soldiers, apparently was gagged, laid on the ground and died. So, this is an American citizen. So clearly, there's no question that the United States should be doing this, and probably is doing it. I think the issue, and this is really the big issue that lies behind a lot of what we've talked about, beyond condemnations and beyond kind of expressions of displeasure and concern and the kind of rhetorical criticisms that the Biden administration has given, is it, what concrete actions should the United States be applying? Not just, first of all, to stop human rights abuses or to get the Israeli government, for example, to really crack down on violent settlers. It's not enough just to make these expressions of concern and condemnations. They need to be backed up by real actions. And I think the real question is what is the United States, what measures, what costs is the United States going to be willing to
So
impose
let
on
me,
Israel?
okay, so
And that's really, without willing to impose costs, without willing to actually make politically difficult choices to threaten Israel with particular costs. It's just rhetoric, and then the situation will continue.
Okay, we're nearing the end, and I'd like to hear Lucy's final thoughts and yours, though. But in order to do so, to streamline it, let me, like we did at the outset, let me submit another idea for you to relate to. Okay, so there is this sense that there's a status quo. Okay, that nothing is happening. There's neither terrorism nor, but there is no status quo. There's no terrorism, but there's no political, progress being made. But there is no status quo because, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, as far as Israelis are concerned, the occupation lingers, and the U.S. has said repeatedly that the status quo is unsustainable, quote unquote, as they mentioned for many times. You know, it's one of those Middle East conflict fortune cookies that you have a 1 in 5 chance of getting that piece of paper and that cookie. The status quo is unsustainable. Okay, that being established, Lucy, if you had a 30-minute one-on-one session with President Biden, which is the title of our conversation here today, if you had a 30-minute, a 20 minutes, one-on-one, you walk into the Oval Office and he's saying, Lucy, I value your opinion, your research, your work. I have nothing to say. I want to hear from you. What would you have me do? Joe Biden, President of the United States of America, 26th of January, 2020. What should I do?
I think I think at the top is the reminder of what you just said.
You can say you're not going to the meeting, not forcing
right, so
it.
assuming I take the meeting, look, as you said, the top line of this is there is no status quo. There is no such thing. Nothing is static. The situation is constantly deteriorating. And I actually wouldn't say there is no terrorism. There is terror and violence happening on a daily basis, perpetrated on both sides from people from the communities on both sides. So while we are not, the fact that we are not, God forbid, in another second intifada type situation, does not mean that bad things aren't happening on the ground and will only get worse. The trajectory, it's going in the wrong direction. And in fact, you even saw, I think just this week, former chief of staff of the IDF, Gadi Eisenkot, said we're getting to, there's a ticking time bomb. He was referring to Palestinian society and what he sees in the Palestinian youth. This is going towards an unmanageable, for Israel, he's speaking from an Israeli perspective, one state situation outcome.
Yes.
And therefore, to go back to where I started, these two pillars that I sort of identified, or principles that the Biden administration seemed to have, which is, let's reverse what we can, but at the end of the day, let's keep this from distracting us from other priorities. I would go back to my premise that the only way you're going to be able to ultimately keep this from distracting you from other priorities is to do more than just wait for the next conflagration and manage piecemeal here and there things in the meantime until you're able to firefight. You have got to start addressing these conflict drivers upfront, what I call, again, extending this metaphor, fireproofing. You've got to address these things that drive the conflict on the ground. Dov has been mentioning some of them. And so I think that means, while this is, I recognize a tricky, there's a cost benefit calculation here for the administration, I realize, and it's probably easy to look at it and say, what do I gain from this other than a big political headache, either domestically? As I think Dov pointed out at the beginning, there's an argument to say that down the road, you're looking at a bigger domestic political headache if you don't address some of these. But beyond that, the fact that the Middle East doesn't seem to be burning right now because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't resolved, or that we're not in the kind of situation that we saw during the Second Intifada years, does not mean that we can rest on our laurels and be complacent. Because, as I said, there is no political horizon. I have not heard an answer to what do you do in the absence of moving towards a political solution to this conflict. And so, rolling up our sleeves to do.
So this is what you would say to the president.
Hopefully it would be a little bit more refined and targeted in this. I'd have a bit more time and notice before the meeting with the president to do that. But I think bottom line is meeting the administration where they are. If you want this to stay off your desk as a long-term persistent headache that distracts you from other things, there's a menu of items, and we all know them, that can be done. It requires using leverage. It requires sticks and carrots, incentives and disincentives. Dov has been referring to them, and an active decision has to be made to use them. I think this is an administration, I said, that's not an administration of novices on this issue. They know what those things are that can be done. And that, for both sides, it's the political will to do it. And that requires, in order to move towards that political will, it requires a recognition that the alternative is worse. And my argument would be the alternative is worse, if not tomorrow.
Dolph, you have a few moments with the president.
Yeah, just,
and
sure, my quick advice to the President Biden would be, first of all, I guess, stop treating the Bennett-Lapid government with kid gloves, with the fear that, if you say or do anything, the government will collapse. And therefore, this has kind of paralyzed the Biden administration, that this is actually, the government at least going to be around for a while longer. And therefore, you can afford to be a bit more assertive with the government, with the Bennett-Lapid government over the issues that are important. But more broadly, if you want to leave a legacy on this subject, and if you want to be really ambitious on this issue, then as I've suggested earlier, moving toward immediate recognition of Palestinian statehood would be the most dramatic way to revive the possibility of an eventual two-state solution, would change the diplomatic situation and be willing to impose costs on the Israeli government if it continues to its practices of evictions of Palestinians, home demolitions in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, expansion of settlements in outlying areas of the West Bank. Some of these things the Biden administration is already doing in behind the scenes, but conveying a willingness to back up that kind of quiet, behind the scenes diplomacy with really a willingness that we are willing, if need be, to impose costs. I'm not talking about economic sanctions. I'm talking initially of diplomatic costs, not shielding Israel from the diplomatic costs. Showing it now, that requires a willingness to engage in a political fight if necessary, domestic, as the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush administration, Jim Baker was willing to do. I think if they're willing to really show a willingness to be tough when necessary, that I think will get the attention of the Israeli government. At the moment, as long as they know that the Biden administration doesn't really have the stomach for a fight with the Israeli government, or is more worried about Netanyahu returning to office than the deteriorating status quo, then the Bennett government isn't going to do very much. That's going to be politically painful for it in order to meet the demands of the Biden administration.
I agree. Lucy, thank you very much. Dov, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Obviously, we couldn't cover everything. I apologize to the questions that we didn't cover and didn't take. Most are very good questions. I hope it was covered by Dov and Lucy, irrespective of the question. Ron, I see that you have something to say, so thank you for making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy and Dov and Alon. It was a really provocative discussion. My one takeaway, if I can summarize, is that the status quo is not a status quo at all. So that would be what I would, if I had to, give in one sentence. So I want to thank you all. It was a really provocative discussion. Thanks to everyone on the Partners for Progressive Israel side for making it happen, especially my colleague Dinesh, working this webinar behind the scenes. Hope you enjoyed it. For anyone who missed my little intro at the beginning, we're going to have a webinar on February 16th, and that's going to examine the Israeli left, and that's labor, but to a larger extent merits its participation in the current Israeli government, which is predominantly center-right. And so we'll be looking at that and its tactics and its philosophy of what it's doing there. Last but not least, while this program has been free, it's generous contributions that enable the organization to deliver the events at no cost. So I see Dinesh has put the link, but you can visit progressiveisrael.org, check out the website and wander over to the donation page and check out any other upcoming programming. So thank you again for tuning in. Thanks to our panel. Stay informed, stay safe, and be well.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you again, thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.